As she leaned over the fire, tasting her stew, something in the corner caught her eye. Pausing her spoon midair, her eyes narrowed in on some stray bits of dirt that must have gathered over the afternoon. Martha momentarily considered the dirt, but shaking her head, she quickly turned away. The dirt would just have to wait, because her taste buds were screaming that the stew needed more flavor. A stress-filled, shaky exhale escaped from her pursed lips. She did not have time for this. Her guests had already arrived, which meant dinner was already late, and oh, how that bothered her. Of all the meals Martha had hosted over the years, this one mattered to her the most. She so wanted it to be perfect, to honor the teacher, and it was not going well. Pushing herself to quicken the pace, she grabbed the extra herbs she had brought in from the garden, and in one motion stripped the leaves from their stem with pinched fingers. As she began to grind them, she immediately caught the savory, earthy scent they released, hoping it wasn't too much seasoning to add at this stage. She glanced at the platter next to her and studied its contents. Figs, olives, bread, goat cheese, all arranged perfectly. Although, with one hand she reached over and adjusted the bread, seeing how one side had a slightly better color than the other. Yes, that helped, but now that it caught her eye, it bothered her. Grabbing the last sprigs of rosemary, she laid them next to the bread, satisfied that this both hid the too pale color while also adding some green to the display. Her satisfaction was fleeting, though. As she turned her attention back to the herbs, her right hand had continued to grind. No, not herbs. Specks. Tiny green specks lay before her, and specks were certainly not acceptable. She internally criticized herself, regretting this moment of distraction that had caused her to overgrind. Looking up, she glanced at her sister Mary, who was still not in the kitchen, not even checking in. Martha was beyond frustrated with her. She needed Mary to get more herbs so she could start over, just like she had needed Mary to chop the vegetables, cut the fruit, strain the cheese, soak the lentils. Martha simply could not do one extra thing. There was still the stew to get right, the wine to pour, the table to set. Oh, the dirt! Before she could forget, she grabbed the rag and wiped up the corner, and the stray herbs that had fallen to the ground, and the ashes that had scattered from the fire, and a spare olive that had escaped. She then resumed her post, discerning whether she could get away with the green specks, or if she could spare the sprigs currently hiding the imperfect loaf of bread. The fact that she even had to choose stirred up the anger simmering in her chest, which became more and more intense with each passing minute. If Mary were here, doing her duty, Martha would not have to choose. She had planned this whole evening with the expectation that she would not be cooking this entire meal alone. She sighed again, loudly. Though she hated doing it, she decided she could probably get away with the crushed herbs in the stew. She would rather keep the whole sprigs intact to hide the bread. She dumped the specks into the stew resentfully, stirring the pot perhaps a bit too hard, willing them to disappear from view while still improving the taste. From the other room, she heard everyone laugh and quickly picked out Mary's voice as the only females in the room. The sound caused Martha's eyes to close, her shoulder muscles to contract. Martha was embarrassed by her sister. She could not believe that Mary was still with Jesus and that she had chosen to sit at his feet. That was where a disciple sat, not a woman, not her sister. Mary's audacity reflected poorly on Martha, and frankly, it hurt her. She had counted on her sister, and she was left with bitter disappointment and a deeper lack of trust in Mary. But seeing as how Mary was not budging, Martha grabbed the pile of plates and went to set them on the table. She slammed them down too hard. unconsciously hoping Mary would hear that Martha was doing the task meant for her, that she would suddenly realize her selfishness and would come help her finish. Martha carefully placed Jesus' plate and cup at the seat designated for him, saddened that Mary was costing her the excitement she had had for today. Martha was so honored that Jesus had accepted her invitation to dinner, and she had been confident in her ability to host him well. Her vision of the evening had encompassed welcoming Jesus into her home, a home that was at its cleanest and tidiest, providing him with a comfortable place to sit, having the meal nearly completed so she could be an attentive host. She pictured compliments about the fullness of her table, the distinct deep flavors of her stew, and the creaminess of the cheese she had churned herself. The conversation would be lively and continue into the late evening. Her goal was for Jesus to leave with a full belly, a rested mind, and proof that Martha's home was the place where he would be cared for and nurtured. Instead, she had greeted Jesus at the door with a smile, giving the illusion that everything was fine, then rushed back to the kitchen, cringing at the disorganized sight that seemed so obviously in his view. Mary had taken over hosting for a moment, but Martha had expected her to promptly and politely excuse herself so she could assist Martha. This was the societal norm. The first couple of minutes had gone by, and Martha had been surprised not to see her sister. But as the minutes continued to pass, Martha became more and more appalled, more and more frustrated, and more hurt. Where was she? Slamming down a spoon, Martha's bitterness bubbled, threatening to take over. Mary was the reason Martha was short on time. Martha slammed down a plate. Mary was the reason Martha was angry instead of under control and relaxed. She slammed down a bowl. Really, what could Mary possibly be doing that was more important than this? They had to eat. If Martha were to abandon the dinner preparations like her sister, what would happen? There would be no food, no drink. There would be hungry bellies and an unwelcoming atmosphere. Why did it have to be up to Martha to do everything? Spoon, plate, bowl, slam, slam, slam. And with that, Martha finished setting the table. An audible huff escaped her tightened chest, knowing that she had completed yet another task without help. Wiping the perspiration accumulating on her cheeks, she once again made her way to the kitchen. Mary had not even moved, clearly captivated by whatever Jesus was saying. Martha strode to the pot and lifted the ladle to stir it. As she did so, she noticed some of the contents on the bottom were sticking. Her stomach dropped, fearing the worst. Bending down a little further, she dared to sniff, and automatically hot tears filled her eyes. Her stew, the one she had made so many times before, the one she had perfected and was most proud of, was burning. Quickly, she reached for her water jug, heaved it up on her hip, and gushed the entire contents onto the fire, extinguishing it with a definitive hiss and a billow of smoke. It stung her eyes and made them leak even more tears. Glancing over towards the other room, it looked like no one had even noticed. Was she that invisible? Were her tasks so unworthy of help and notice? Her anger boiled to a point of no return, and Martha lost control. Storming into the room, Martha's focus was on the carefree posture of her sister. She traipsed over and stood right next to Jesus, actually leaning in front of him to catch Mary's eyes, to force her to finally look at her. Startled, Mary glanced up. Martha loomed over her with frizzy hair, flushed cheeks, and accusing eyes. For a moment, the whole room simply paused, surprised at the state of an unusually unkempt Martha. Mary could immediately tell she had disappointed her sister. Again, she automatically looked down at the floor, really not wanting to be criticized in front of Jesus. Martha, however, did not want her compassion aroused. Mary had hurt her, frustrated her, and embarrassed her, and she could not swallow her anger anymore. So without taking her eyes off Mary, Martha addressed Jesus. "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Martha was vaguely aware that her tone was biting, that her unmet expectations were coloring her ability to handle the situation with composure. But right now, she honestly did not care. It was not right that she was having to do all of this alone. It was not fair that the meal she had worked twice as hard to complete was now subpar at best. Mary needed to see the cost of her choice. And since she would apparently only listen to Jesus, Martha would make sure it was he who corrected her. Martha folded her arms, sniffed, waited. She saw Mary shift uncomfortably, glancing at the kitchen for the first time. Martha watched her sister's expression sober as she took in the many chores Martha had completed, mixed with the leftover mess of those chores being completed with a rushed hand. Mary quickly intuited why her sister was so angry. Martha felt a momentary sense of relief. Finally, her sister realized what she had forced Martha to do on her own. But then Martha felt a pull on her elbow, causing her arms to unfold. The gentleness of the motion jolted her into realizing what she had just done. Now slightly embarrassed by her outburst, she became flustered as Jesus stood to face her. He took both of her hands. Like her sister, Martha did not feel comfortable meeting his gaze. She braced herself, expecting to be chastened for her tone. She could bear that chastening, but she still expected Jesus to agree with her overall. She saw Jesus' shoulders rise and fall in an intentional sigh, saw him glance towards the kitchen, taking in the slightly controlled mess. His focus then returned to their hands. He adjusted his grip so his hands completely covered hers as he spoke. "Martha, Martha," he said. He repeated her name, and she was surprised at the emotion she sensed in his voice. It was a tone that communicated a sad kind of understanding, as if he knew what she was going through, and yet saw a picture much bigger than the one she could see. It communicated that something important was about to be said, and she already knew it would not be what she wanted to hear. Really, anything other than agreeing with her would make her feel too vulnerable, too much like failure. He let her prepare for a moment, indeed wanting her to listen. "You are worried and upset about many things." She fought back the instinct to roll her eyes. "Obviously," she wanted to say. "But Martha," Jesus continued. He shifted his posture, but brought his eyes up to meet hers, his gaze steady. "There is only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her." All of Martha's muscles seemed to tense at once. A resistance was quickly welling up within her, a bristling. Her physical and mental instinct was to defend herself against this unexpected response, to justify her actions. Had Jesus really just insinuated that Mary was right and Martha was wrong? No, never had Martha been accused of doing the wrong thing. Accused of overreacting? Yes. Getting too stressed? Yes, but never doing the wrong thing. She had always prided herself on exceeding expectations. Promptly, she removed her hands from Jesus' grip, but then did not know what to do with them. Scratching the back of her neck as a placeholder, she just folded her arms back up again. Martha was mad at Jesus. What he said stung, regardless of his tone, because it implied that Jesus, someone she respected so much, believed that she had made a mistake. She found herself longing to move, to escape from this incredibly awkward moment where all eyes were on her, waiting for her response. And yet Jesus remained next to Martha, willing to stand in the awkwardness with her, unwilling to abandon the relationship, despite the tension. Swallowing at least a bit of pride, Martha dared to ask herself, had she really made the wrong choice? She had been taught that being a good host meant providing the very best you could offer. That is what Martha had been trying so hard to do, to endure and sacrifice so that she could provide Jesus with her best. As if knowing where her thoughts were going, Jesus raised his eyebrows a bit at her. This was his point, wasn't it? Martha had utterly worn herself out, trying to prove to Jesus that she was exceptional. And yet here she stood, frazzled and exhausted, angry and bitter. She may have been able to provide Jesus with her best food and the best atmosphere she could create, but at what cost? Martha herself had nothing left to offer. Her best had been spent on a task list, not her guest, not her teacher. Guilt now joined her other emotions, and her shoulders slumped slightly. Immediately she went into fix-it mode. Surely she could find a way to right the wrong. She forced herself to look Jesus in the eyes, but in his gaze she did not see something she could fix. She saw the invitation he was offering her. It was okay to stop. Despite her gender, despite the task at hand, it was okay that Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to him. And it would be okay if Martha took the same posture, that of a disciple. In some ways, that was a beautiful thought, a longing even. And yet, as she considered the idea, stress automatically sent itself tingling throughout her whole body. Accepting Jesus' offer would mean setting aside her task list, unfinished. Dinner would remain unready. The stew would continue to burn in the overheated pot. The cheese would get too warm and start to sweat. The juices from the fruit would leak and make the bread soggy. And it would be her fault, or at least her choice, if that happened. Tension and anxiety pushed firmly against the invitation from Jesus, causing her to freeze in indecision. She looked back and forth between Jesus, Mary, and the kitchen, mentally sitting in this internal tension, not knowing what she should do. She felt like she was disappointing someone either way, but she knew a choice had to be made. She was either going to finish dinner or she wasn't. An awkward silence continued to permeate the room. Mary remained in her spot, overwhelmed with the affirmation she had just received. The disciples watched in awe of Jesus' willingness to interact with women in this way, learning much about time spent from the interaction they observed. Martha stood still on the outside as her battle raged inside, visible only through a wrinkle on her forehead and the tense posture she maintained. And Jesus stood with Martha, whom he loved, full of truth, but also full of grace, silently continuing to extend the invitation to his friend.